Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Text to Table. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you for tuning in with us tonight. I have the parents at the table talking about navigating conversations with children around what's happening in our current environment right now, talking about racism. We want to know how you're handling these situations. So I'm going to introduce my wonderful panel here of parents, and I'm going to ask Wanda to start us off.
Hi, I'm Wanda. I'm a CEO in Silver Spring, Maryland. I have 2 adult children and 2 adult children who we helped raise. And I'm looking forward to sharing any tips I can.
Awesome. Thank you for being with us, Wanda. Aliyah.
Hey, Aliyah. I am the executive director of an association in Maryland. I have 2 sons, ages 9 and 17. I'm really happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you for being with us tonight. Dresden.
Hi, my name is Dresden Farrand. I'm a CEO in the DC metro area. I have 3 kids, of 8-year-old and 2 5-year-old girls.
Awesome. Rhonda.
Hey. I'm Rhonda. I'm a longtime association exec, a learning leader, and an entrepreneur. I am also the mom of 2 amazing young women, Blair, who's 30, and Mia, who will be 9 next month. So glad you're here with us.
Thank you for joining us, Rhonda. And last but not least, Johnny.
Thank you, Donté. Hello, everyone. I'm Johnnie White. I'm a CEO for an organization in Reston. And I have 2 kids. I have a son that's 20 years old and a daughter that's 28.
Awesome. And of course, I'm Donté Shannon, one of the co-hosts of Text to Table. I'm going to kick us right off. I want to start first, though. I know we're on this show to talk tonight about, children, raising children right now during current times. But let's talk first about ourselves as children and growing up in our various generational times. I remember being in kindergarten. I had to be around 4 or 5 years old, and I was in pre-K, and I believe I was the only Black student in my class. If not, there were maybe one other Black student. But I remember my class being majority white, and everybody in my kindergarten class had gotten invited to this birthday party. There was a young girl who was having a birthday party in my kindergarten class, and everybody got invited but me. And so I remember my mom coming to pick me up the Friday before the party was supposed to happen, and I told my mom, I was like, everybody's going to this birthday party tomorrow, but I didn't get invited. Can I still go? Even though I didn't get invited. And my mom was like, no, you cannot go. And so I was like, well, why not? Like, I haven't been bad. I've been good. My grades are good. The teachers have been saying good things about me. I was pleading with her to go to this party. And she simply said to me, she's like, you can't go because you're Black. My first response to her was, I'm not Black. At 4 or 5, my context of Black was like the crayon color. And so I knew, I was like, I'm not Black like a crayon color. Like, what are you talking about? And so she was just, my mom was like, Donté, some people aren't going to like you because of your race. You're a Black man, or you're a Black little boy. And some people are not going to like you because of that. And I remember just being perplexed. And I was just like, are you, what? Like, no, that's not true. Like, there's another reason why I didn't get invited to this party. And as I grew up, one of the things I thought about was that a missed opportunity from my mom to really go into more context and explain in more detail to me this whole construct around race, Black, white, whatever. As I thought about it more, I was like, for a 4 or 5-year-old, my mom probably did not want to go that deep with me. There was probably some innocence she wanted to protect. And me being a 4 or 5-year-old and not really kind of going into this race conversation that I mentally probably was not prepared to navigate or even understand.
I think my first experience goes back to the fact that I grew up and was put in situations by my mother where I was the only one. My early elementary experience, I was the only one in the class or the only one in the grade. And, it started with private school when I was in pre-elementary, pre-K, that kind of thing. And then when we moved to Montgomery County, when I was, in fourth grade, I was the, one of two or three. And I don't think I really understood it until I went to public school. I don't remember it in private school, but once I moved to public school, it was very clear I was different and there weren't many like me. And my mother didn't really explain it. The explanation for why I was in that environment was because she was totally focused on education. She wanted to make sure that I got the best possible education that she could afford. And in her mind, that was putting me in this environment where there were not a lot of people of color. And I think that reflects back to her upbringing as a woman who was born in the South and fled the South and came north. And you couldn't get her back in the South if, you paid her, because that was not where she wanted to be. That wasn't something she was thinking about anymore. So I think I became very aware of it when I went to public school, probably in about fourth grade. And it was more the fact that there were so few of us that we didn't exactly understand what world we were in. And it took me a long time to sort of find my place as a Black woman, because I was primarily around, people who did not look like me. So it was a gradual thing. And I think it really crystallized probably when I met my husband, who grew up in the same county, but in the Black section, right? He grew up with the Black people. I grew up with the white people, and we came together, and he was like, you're kind of different. And it was, all in, how I talk, how I carried myself. It just wasn't, part of, I didn't have those cultural experiences, and my mother didn't really talk about it. She wasn't focused on race. She was focused on do what you have to do to get ahead.
Johnnie, what about you? What was your first awakening to the social construct of race?
Interesting you say crayon. That was kind of part of my story and being awakened to this. So we grew up in a pretty mixed neighborhood, mostly white, but we had a few Black families in the neighborhood. And we lived next door to this neighbor that had a daughter. It was probably about a couple of years older than I was. I think at the time I was maybe 6 and she was probably 8 or 9. And we were playing. And she had made this statement to me. She said, "You know what? You are the color of the crayon Negro." Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but on the crayon, it said Negro.
Wow.
That was kind of the first time that I learned that word or heard that word. And I was like, no, that's not me, and that sort of thing. So, I went to my mom and I said, "Hey, Denise called me the color of Negro." My mom was livid. I mean, she's like, how the hell? She's pretty upset about that. She had called the neighbor over, the father, the daughter, and they had a son, an older son. And she sat down with them and said, that was inappropriate that your daughter called my son, the color of Negro. And she actually had the crayon in her hand and said, "Does he look this color?" And she said, "I didn't know, I apologize." And he was very apologetic, the gentleman, and he kind of talked to his daughter. But that was my first time, coming across something like that, because I did not think of me, being looked upon as the color of Negro.
Was there a conversation, Johnnie, with you after that situation in your home, or was it just kind of like handled?
It was. And my mom, she used it as a lesson. She said, don't ever let anybody label you in any way. And that was the lesson she taught me, that you don't let anybody put you in a space. In this scenario, she was trying to put me in the space of, again, being the color of a crayon. So don't let them dictate who you are. You dictate who you are. And so from that point forward, I was pretty voiceless in terms of the things that I portrayed myself as I went on from there.
So I was really thinking back on this because in my family it was a very racially conscious home. My father had been a part of the Nation of Islam for quite some time, and he ran the farms that they had in the South across from Georgia all the way to Louisiana. And so just the way we were raised, it was very conscious of Blackness and being Black and what that meant. But what I remember is when it became something of an issue. And that was when we were in Massachusetts, and I remember being on the bus and being called names and getting kicked. And that was the first time I really felt like there was something wrong with it. And I do remember that experience. And as we're, talking about how we sort of navigated all this as children, with my family having a very conscious, very Black, conscious, blackety black, 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 as the song goes, family, we were often put in situations where we were the only ones. At one point, we were the only ones in an entire country. And so it's just been with me the whole time. Everywhere I go, it's there. And so as far as I can remember, the Blackness has been there. But that bus incident was really the first time where I thought someone thought it was problematic. And that was a little bit different.
How old were you, Aliyah, again?
It must have been like 4 or 5, because I think it was around kindergarten. And this is when they were doing the busing in Boston.
Desegregating schools, I think.
Yeah.
Rhonda, what about your story?
Sure. So I have some commonalities with the other guests. My parents were fairly racially conscious. They'd both had lots of encounters with racism and asserting and fighting for rights of Black people in their own upbringing. They went to historically Black college where they met. And so I don't really have a precise time where I remember knowing that I was Black. It was something that was just true in my home, right? But similarly, the point where I realized that some other people had some issue with that was probably when I was about 5. I think there's some commonalities in terms of age for all of us, because this is when our memories are forming and what we can really remember as adults, right? Going back to that kind of 3, 4, 5-year-old kind of self. I was on the playground. A classmate in kindergarten called me a nigger in front of all the other kids. And I had and I knew I was Black, but I didn't know that he meant that. I just knew it was something nasty because the way he said it was nasty. It was mean, and I knew it. And I knew that other people on the playground knew what it meant more than I knew what it meant. And most of the other people on the playground, almost all were white. I was a predominantly white education system all the way through college. And so I went home very curious about this word I'd been called, and I could hardly recount it because I didn't know the word. And my parents, they knew, right? They knew as soon as I tried to get it out. And they swiftly just swept it under the rug. Donté, like you, they did not take that time as any kind of a teachable moment for me. It was more a time of protection for me. And I can see that now, as I got older, I realized in hindsight that what they were doing as parents is what, all of us want to do, is protect our kids.
Dresden, tell us your story. And you grew up in Iowa, right?
I did, and I do share a lot of commonality with a lot of the guests as well. I grew up in Iowa, very much an all-white environment, small town of 8,000. If it took you more than 2 minutes to cross the entire town, you're angry. But my experience is different. I really relate to Aliyah, but even more so in that I grew up in a very academic household, a very racially engaged household. Both my parents grew up poor and went into disadvantaged neighborhoods. My father from the South, my mother from East Side Detroit, and she was a Black Panther for many years through college and grad school. And so I grew up in a home where race was talked about all the time. My mother wrote books on race. My mother's a sociologist. So I knew from a very, very early age that I was Black. And I also knew from an early age that it might be problematic. I knew the N-word by the time my first incident happened, and I'd heard the stories. We were the type of family where, I watched Do the Right Thing when it came out in 1986. I watched Roots by the time I was 8. So this notion of protecting your children through the sense of innocence, which I understand, that just was something that was that's a foreign concept in my household. Now I am doing things a little differently with my own kids, considering their ages of 8 and 2 5-year-olds. But in a lot of ways, I'm doing things similarly because of this time that we're growing up in now. But my first incident with it, where I was like, whoa, this is really real, all the things that they've been telling me, was on the bus. I was called the N-word and I was beat up, and I got dropped off at my bus stop. The bus driver said, go tell your parents. And I went inside, my mother was home, and I just said, and I was crying, and I said, I just got beat up and they were calling me the N-word, Mom. And, what are you going to do? And my mother looked at me and she said, what did you do? And I was like, well, I tried to, I told them to leave me alone, and the bus driver told me to tell you. She said, no. What have I taught you? To defend myself. And see, my mom was very much, more probably a Malcolm X than a Martin Luther King. And we all know what that means. So, and she was upset with me because I did not defend myself. And she sent me to my room that evening. Mm-hmm. You can imagine. And I've never forgotten that. And so for me, I knew very early on that me being Black meant that I was going to have to fight. Me being Black and being my parents' child meant that they had high expectations for how I carried myself and my Blackness. That thing, do better, try harder, don't give up. Education, always, the intensity and the pressure of that was very real. Mm-hmm. So that's my own sort of first beginnings. Yeah.
As you all, I think, have already noticed, there's a lot of commonalities in all of our experiences and having this awakening to race in this country. But I think maybe one note that a lot of parents who are watching might want to take is that these situations also happen outside of the home, where a lot of us were isolated, right? These happen on the playground, on the bus, in the classroom, where we didn't necessarily have our parents right there at that moment to protect us or help us navigate those things. And so it really was us kind of like being like, what? Like, what? Like, let me check in with my parents about this, and how I'm supposed to be feeling about this. So parents, as you watch this, just consider that, these instances, these situations are probably happening as early as 4 or 5, as soon as your kids are able to interact with other folks. And we all know that racism is taught in the home, and so just having that awareness that people are not teaching your kids the same thing, or people are not teaching their kids the same thing you're teaching your kids at home. Right. And into these public spaces, the playground, the bus, the classroom, they're going to be encountered with all of these different narratives and all kind of things if you're a kid of color, that are coming from other homes, and being dumped on them. One of the things I think would be interesting to know is, in your experiences and when you told your parents about your experiences, based on how they handled that situation, what they did or did not do at the moment, how have you taken that experience and used it with your own children in their first experiences, or if they've even had first experiences? Have you carried over some of those same behaviors, or have you, as Rhonda stated, put into place protections that you want to kind of keep your kids away from these conversations right now? I'd love to hear the different contrasts and how you all are navigating that.
What's interesting is, and like I said, I've experienced it very kind of visceral racism, not the microaggressions, visceral racism from people from the time I was 4 or 5 to now. And as I was thinking back, as we were going to be preparing for this conversation, I realized I never told my parents about any of it. I never told them. And why?
Yeah.
I think because I just felt like I was supposed to handle it. Like, what were they going to do? Honestly, like that's, I really did. There was one instance actually where my mother got it out of me, This was a little bit later. Now that I think about it, there was one instance. I didn't tell. She figured it out. It was when I was doing college interviews. And my first choice, I ended up going to Smith College, but my first choice was Wellesley. My grandmother and I used to go to Wellesley all the time. Like, that was just our thing. I was going to Wellesley. And I was in boarding school in England. And so I had to go into London to do the interview. And so I went to this home in Earl's Court, and it was this older woman, and the interview was horrific. I can't even, the lady was asking me, do I plan to go there and march and protest like all the other Black students that do there? And her daughter tells her this and that about the Black women that are there. It was just on and on and on and on. It was awful. And so my mother called me because she knew that, this was like my top choice and, what I wanted to do. And I was like, oh, it's fine. Just not really wanting to talk about it. And she let it go. And then like a week later, she called back. I was like, okay, what happened? And so I did then tell her. And the funny thing, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about parenting and what we've learned, but my grandmother was very active in my grandmother just knew everybody in Boston. That basically, she just knew everybody. And so my mother, of course, called my grandmother. My grandmother called the school, and their response was, if she wants to come, she can come. And at that time I said, why would I want to go there? Right. And Smith ended up being a great experience for me, and nothing to take away from Smith, but knowing what I know now, I should have gone because she won. But that's the only time that I recall talking to my parents about it, and they had to pull it out of me. I wasn't going to share that with them because I just felt like I was supposed to handle stuff on my own and deal with it how I could deal with it to best to navigate. And as many of the other panelists were talking about, I was often in situations, whether it was school, social situations, where I was the only, and where my kind of survival meant navigating those experiences so that I could continue to be okay in those environments. So it's it was what it was. I don't know what to say. That's just what it was. And I was talking to my son, my 9-year-old, and I asked him, have you had any, I asked him first, did he know what racism was? And he said, yes. And I said, well, what is it? And he, said, when somebody treats you bad because of the color of your skin and the way you look. And I said, okay, that's, for a 9-year-old. Okay, we got it. And I asked him if he had any racial experiences, or had he experienced racism? Because I didn't think he had, because he's been pretty protected. And he said, no, not visually. But I see, the expression you guys just made is exactly what I did. I said, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, no one's visually done that to me, but I do know about, what's happening with the police and with the cops and that kind of thing. And, I'd be worried if I had to interact with the police officer, but he said, but, visually, no, nothing's happened to me. Okay.
I think there's a really great point that was added in that, I don't remember really talking to my mother about race because I knew she had some very strong feelings, but we never discussed it. And I think, again, it was because she was an older mother. She came from the South, where she experienced a lot of racism. And as I got older, she started to share those stories. So I was expected, to Leah's point, to be able to handle it. However, I will also say she always had my back, in that if I felt like I was in a situation where someone, an adult or someone, was either taking advantage of me or treating me unfairly, she drilled into me from probably the moment I could talk, you need to call my mother. The phone number is blah, blah, blah. And, whatever situation I got in, and being mouthy, sometimes I got in a few. That was the way she put forward an activism in me to not allow people to treat me any old way or to talk to me any old way. If I felt there was a problem, I would recite my line and hold my ground until they called her. And you know, she would then take up the battle. And I think that was because I was an only child, and I was in these situations where she knew I was going to be the only one. So, you know, rather than me take that to a level where I could be heard or I could be taken advantage of in some way, she taught me and to recite that and to play that card anytime I felt that the conversation wasn't going the right way. And I distinctly remember, you know, a vice principal in school who was, no doubt about it, racist. And, you know, a group of people did something and I was singled out as the culprit. And I was like, no way, you know, it's either all or none. And I just, you know, kind of stood my ground, and she wrote in at some point and they had some kind of conversation and I went back to class. You know, it was years later I got all the pieces, but, you know, for the most part, she handled it to make sure that I had the backup to not, you know, allow myself. But I really didn't, I agree. I didn't share a lot. I felt like I was prepared to deal with that. And if it got beyond my capability, I knew to call my backup.
And you know, as I'm hearing this, and it just reminds me of stuff. I mean, these stories or these conversation brings up things. And you know, I talked about my mom, and you know, so my mom grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, in the north. So you know, very different perspective on blacks and whites and so forth. But then I look at my dad, and my parents were divorced, but you know, I would go with him on weekends and then be with my mom. But as I think back at my dad grew up in West Virginia. And he, as you pull back the layers for him, he had a really, really tough time when it comes down to racism. And I still remember when we would go to West Virginia, we would drive straight to West Virginia and do not stop anywhere. And I think this was just something that was ingrained in him, to never stop anywhere, because you never know what happened. Because he tells us stories of getting in the car with his father, and they would drive somewhere and they would not stop anywhere. And time was changing, but he still had that, he still had that mentality. And I still remember there's one time when a police officer pulled us over, and my dad, you know, he's a brave guy. You wouldn't think anything would bother him, but that guy was shaking like a leaf when that police officer pulled him over. And it was just him and us three kids sitting in the back. And we all just recognized him, you know, talking to the police officer. You could tell his voice was trembling. He was shaking. And literally after that, you know, he had to pull off to the side, you know, after the police officer let him go, just to get himself together. And you know, these memories are coming back now as I think about my father and think back about my mother. And I never really talked about racism with my father, because my mindset was, you know, he unfortunately probably went through a tough time with that. And he was, you know, it wouldn't have been a good conversation with him. So.
And it's crazy, Johnny, because you're right. Hearing everyone else's story keeps like bringing things up that I really haven't thought about in so long. I have a similar memory of my family driving from the Northeast down to a very rural part of Georgia. And we also often drove, a big family, and we didn't stop. We didn't stop, especially in certain places. And I remember a time where we were pulled over and having this whole kind of emotional roller coaster, because I'd not seen my dad seem afraid like that before. When he was taken out of the car, when the officer had his hand on the gun and all this stuff. It was bizarre, and I kind of began to understand over time what my parents were kind of holding inside, right? They were protecting us from some things and trying to help us lean into our culture on the other hand. But really, there was a lot of pain and fear behind it, and it really was quite disturbing for me to see that. In order to cope over the years when I was growing up, my parents really leaned, I think, like some of the other panelists, on education as a way to overcome or combat racism. And kind of not just kind of the personal or interpersonal racism, but kind of the structural kind, right? this could open doors for us. And so there was a real huge emphasis put on education for me. And in that way, that's probably true for me and my own parenting. That is not something that's no longer true, although I would say I have my own take on it, right? My take on it is, yes, it can open doors, but I try to shift that to a focus on enjoying learning and the love of learning and what learning can do to enrich our own lives, rather than how learning can be used and almost weaponized against racism, right? I felt like that was the wrong driver. And so I held on to that. That certainly was something that just really became part of the fabric of who I am. But I pivoted it a little bit when raising my own children. It was important to me that they have a love of learning, because of how it enriches themselves and how it equips them to impact the world, but not how it equips them to impact racism, right? My parents' philosophy was more of a excellence at all costs, if not perfection. If I had a B, C, it was the same as having a D or an F. It was all A's, period, or else there was real problems in my house. And that kind of pressure and focus wasn't, I know in hindsight, particularly healthy. But I understand where it came from. It came from a place of love and protection. They taught me that consequences would be greater for me if I made mistakes. And I knew that I have two older brothers, and they taught them the same thing. The consequences could just be wildly different for us for the same actions. And so it was this constant sense of not only suppressing feelings about what we were kind of maybe encountering sometimes, to exert some control over kind of the narrative, but also around seeking almost perfection in order to avoid consequences that we know now are otherwise normal, right? Children need to be able to be children. So I'd say I pivoted in my own parenting in that way as well. I try, and I will admit, I am better at it with my second child than I was with my first. I've learned a lot over the years. There's 20 years between my kids. And so I know now a lot more about my own power and my own place in the world. And I'm able to show up better for my youngest daughter. I talked to my oldest about this conversation we were planning to have. And I said, how'd I do? And when did you first have this conversation? And when did you come to me? And I missed that teachable moment. And she said, for her, really, it was just a sense of being other. It wasn't, some dramatic occurrence that stands out in her memory. It was a constant, steady pressure that really did affect her just as deeply as having something really overt.
I think what's interesting is that, as the other panelists have talked about, education was so important in my upbringing. When I took the long route to get my degree, and I kind of took a pause, my mother informed me that I would be the only person in like 4 generations to not have not just an undergrad degree, but an advanced degree. And I couldn't let the world down in the family by doing that. But I do realize that was so ingrained in me that with my children, my daughter was in college before she realized that not everybody went to college. That was a continuum. They believe that you do high school, you go to college, period. And from my perspective, I was like, yes. And, that's what I wanted you to understand, because again, it was important that narrative, which was part of what I experienced, was important for them. And I think that it was just something that I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I knew that I wanted them to at least have that to level the playing field, because that was something that was just completely ingrained in the way I was brought up.
So using education as a tool against, and that's how you guys change the dynamic with your parenting. Dresden, with your mom being so, I guess, militant or Malcolm, are you taking the Malcolm X approach with your kids, or are you doing more of the Martin Luther King approach?
I'm doing more of the Martin Luther King approach. I will say, I just want to, it's so fascinating how all of the stories that we're telling are really weaving together. My family's, my dad's side of the family is originally from Georgia. So I remember the trips for the family reunion every other year where you don't stop. Rome, Georgia is where we were going.
Oh, goodness.
Education, education
I had a
as
story.
Right. As a weapon, as a tool, as, a means to an end. It was everything to my parents. And so a couple things I'm doing differently is with education, like Wanda just said, I didn't realize that people didn't go to college, right? Now I went to school with kids who were farmers, right? Who, this is Iowa, but I didn't know that. And it wasn't until I started visiting colleges my freshman, sophomore, junior year, and just hearing what my friends were doing. And I was just blown away. I just never knew that. So one of the things I'm doing differently is I want my philosophy, of course, they're young to say this to them now, but we do have conversations. What do you want to be when you grow up? But my thing is, I want you to do what you love. And I want you to get an education. It doesn't have to be a traditional four-year education. And I can feel my mother's eyes right now against the back of my head. But I really do want to insist, that you want to go to culinary school? Great. You want to be Danica Patrick and learn how to drive NASCAR? Fantastic. If you want to be an electrician or an architect and build homes, if you want to go into the trades, for me, it's, I think by not giving them that option, I'm taking away, in a sense, all that they can be. And yes, I know that, education and what it means for Black people and people of color. And I know the reason we go there, and it's everything that we've just said. But I want to give my children a broader perspective. I want them to have a choice. And again, it'd be about your passion and doing something you love. What you just said, Rhonda, I think was key. Learning, loving to learn, right? Another thing is, I'm not as harsh as I would say that my mother was, and I know that it came from a place of love, and she was trying to make me harder because of how she grew up, but also because she was raising me in Iowa, and I was acclimating a lot to just frankly white culture. And there was a lot of things that she saw that she didn't like. She would often say, you're not white. Why are you going outside with your hair wet? Or, the way I would roll my jeans or attempt to feather this curly hair, with my bangs or something. And I thought, well, gosh, now that I'm older, isn't that something? You put me in this environment because you want to give me all the benefits of a good education and a safe environment outside of Detroit, Michigan. And all of this prestige with being, the first African-American tenured professor at Grinnell College, yet you make me feel bad for the privilege that you gave me and the way that I'm acclimating to that. And that's just, and it was shaming. And it's something I just did not ever want to put my children through. So one of the things I did, of course, is we live outside of Washington, D.C. My children have never been the only. They will never experience that. A lot of that stuff was very painful for me on both sides. And then when it comes to race, I'm not as militant, but there's a lot of conversation that takes place in my household. With my son being 9, and in his 9 years, we went to Trayvon Martin. He was 2 years old at the time, the protest, the 14-year-old boy who was killed coming home with Skittles and iced tea. I remember going to the protest with my son at 2. And then since there's just been a string of Black children, 17 and under, across the United States who've literally lost their lives. Tamir Rice, Eric.
Being children.
Right, children who are playing in a park with a toy gun. The boy, I forget his last name, is Johnson, out of Oregon, and he was doing the sword thing because he was, one of these Renaissance, kids who go and fake sword fight. And police were called because there's a man with a sword, and he was shot dead. And so that's all been in my son's short life. So unfortunately, I don't have the privilege of not talking about it with him because it's been everywhere. It's been a part of what we see. It's been a part of, you know, how I feel as a parent, how I let him go out and play and basically be in the world, how I allow him to associate with friends. I don't allow my son to have friends unless I have a real conversation about race with the parents. That's just how we start off, because I don't know what you're saying to my child in the home. You know, I don't know what you believe or don't believe. And frankly, in the last year, with all the crazy people coming out of the woodwork with their racism, I mean, do you really know people the way you really thought you knew them, right? And so with my son, we have those conversations about race. He's very aware of the recent police shootings. We went to several marches, went to the march on Washington. And my son in the beginning was like, why are we doing this? It's so hot. This was like in June, July, and why are we going out there? And now, as I've educated him over the summer, couldn't wait to make his sign for the March on Washington. And that's his reality. That's where we live right now. And he'll even said to me, Mom, he's like, I'm so glad you took me to this because I'm learning how to fight. And when I'm older, I'm going to know what to do. You know, that's the type of things he says to me now because I'm exposing him to this.
I think, you know, the message that we're seeing here from parents-wise is just communicating. And it doesn't stop as they're young. It also continues as they get older. Because again, as you know, some of us have older children. And as I talk to my kids, you know, they're in a position now to influence. And, you know, as my daughter 28 and son 20, you know, they have a very mixed group of friends. And, you know, in our conversations is, you know, how are you influencing your friends to create that awareness of unconscious bias? Because, you know, his friends, and I use my son as an example, as I talk to my son, he says, you know, my friends are all good. You know, they know, you know, racism and they don't do it and so forth. And I say, yeah, I get what you're saying, but you have to also remember that they grew up very differently than you did. They had different parents and that sort of thing. So there's some unconscious bias in there that they don't even realize that they have. So you should have these conversations with them so that, you know, when they are in that situation, they know what to do and what not to do. So that communication, again, as I stated in the beginning, it doesn't stop once they turn, you know, 13, 14, 15. It continues as you see, I have adult children and we're still having this conversation.
Johnnie, just tagging on there, I just have to agree so much. You know, my oldest is 30 years old, but folks with older kids know, and we know from our own parents, you never really stop being their kid. She'll never not be my kid. And as she has grappled with things as an adult woman, as she has sought to get apartments, as she has interviewed for jobs, as she's had issues on the job with racism and sexism, as she's dated, and her partner is a white guy of Irish and Polish background, and it is so top of mind for me, and based on what you said, how we have to keep helping them and one another navigate these realities. She faced considerable racism from her partner's family the first time that she met them. And we needed to really unpack a lot of things with that. And as her mom, that's still been my role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just interesting, I've been talking more to my older son about my experiences. And just two things I want to pick up on. One, in terms of what I'm doing differently, 100% what you guys have all talked about the, you know, education being the key to everything, excellence being the key to everything. I've kind of reframed it because my experiences were, you know, my report card would get sent home. Like I said, I was away from home when I was in high school, and I would get this, back in those days they had telex, I would get a telex. And if I had like a B, or if like, let's say I made the honors list or dean's list and there was something else that was higher, all I'd get back literally was an arrow up to the top and a question mark.
Like, why aren't you here?
Yeah. And that's it. There was nothing in there, nothing. And so with especially my older son, what I always said to him was that I just want you to be able to have options. So with what my parents did was that you have to be excellent because you can do whatever you want to do. You're going to have to work twice as hard, that whole thing. With my son, I explained some of that to him, but it was more in the construct of, I want you to have options. I want you to be able to decide what you want to do. Yes, you can go and do all these things, but you need to be able to be set up so that you can make decisions. You can make choices. You can be in the spaces that you want to be in. Not so much that you can go and be in any space that you want to be because, you're excellent and blah, blah, blah. So that's one thing. So that's what I've changed. The other part is, I agree, I don't know who said this, but also about providing a different level of protection. Like I said, we talked a lot about race and being Black and our family history and all of those things. So we were very conscious, but I was also put in these positions where my brother and I, there's 7 of us total, but one of my brothers and I, we were usually in the same school at the same time in some capacity. And we were typically the only ones in the whole school. And so we had to kind of navigate those experiences. And like I said, when we lived in Singapore, we were the only Black family in the entire country. And so navigating that as a third culture kid was a whole other thing. But what I'll say with my children is that they've been in both private school and public school. The private schools that they went to were predominantly Black. They had very advanced curriculum, but they were predominantly Black schools. The other schools that they have gone to, whether public or private, have been very diverse. So they've never been in a situation where they're the only ones. They may be fewer, but not the only ones. But I did run into a situation, and now, as we're having these conversations, I'm now really thinking about some other experiences that my son and I have had conversations about. So when he was at a private school, he was at a Quaker school here in Maryland, and he was finding that he was the only Black person in his advanced classes, and he did not like that at all. Well, the school is very diverse. The classes that he was in were not as diverse. And we actually ended up moving him out of the school. And that was one of the reasons he asked to leave. He asked to leave the private school and go to the local public school, which I let him do because I wanted him to be in a place where he felt that he could succeed. I had a lot of issues with moving him from the school. I loved the Quaker school. I loved the whole community and everything. It was a very hard decision, but with all the moving around that I did throughout elementary school through high school, and the decisions I didn't really have a say. Well, we're all the generation where you didn't have a say in any kind of conversation. I think we all sort of include our children in some of the decision making now. So to really have him be empowered and explain why he wanted to leave the school, why he wanted to be in a space where there are other, like he said, people like him. And what he meant like that was students who were of color, Black students who were in advanced classes, who were doing different kinds of things. And so I supported that. And so for his last 2 years of high school, he was at our local public high school. And he said it was the best decision I ever made in his life. So I'm going to take that. So pop the collar a little bit. And we're still friends with all the people there. And he's still good friends with a lot of the kids there, but it just wasn't the right environment for him. So I did try to support that.
And I hope you referenced other decisions you've made that have been really good for his life.
I'm like, every decision I make is good for you. We have a joke. It's called TYM, because I tell him stuff and then he wants to go off and do other things. And he comes back, oh yeah, I guess you were right, or da-da-da-da. And I say, TYM, trust your mama. And so when he starts to kind of like push back on things, I'm like, TYM, I'm telling you, it's a TYM. And so it makes him do a second, he thinks, he rethinks his decision and then usually comes to the right one. I told him I never steered him wrong.
Johnnie talked about, one thing I want to explore a little bit is Johnnie talked about how then you have older children now, like they have some influence as well. And so let's explore a little bit of conversation around behaviors and even conversations you've had with your kids that help them start to interrupt racism as they go out into the world as well. Even if it's small kids or if you have older kids, how have you guys found that your conversations have had impact on your kids and them going out into the world and also eradicating racism?
So as the mother of older kids, my children are in their early 30s. They are activists in two different ways. My daughter is an activist in attending marches, joining groups, starting the conversation, trying to make a difference in a broader sphere. And I had to sort of understand why she was so passionate about it. And it was things that we talked about when she was younger, but it wasn't a conscious thing because I didn't grow up with that degree of activism. So I'm seeing that my children are much more public activists than I was. I was probably, the quiet introvert, not necessarily going out there and joining the marches. My son is a very different activist, and he's doing it more on the basis of one-on-one opportunities. And he relayed a conversation that he had with a friend of his who is a police officer. The friend is white, and they got into a really interesting and very deep conversation about what was going on in the world. And as Corey was describing it to me, and I said, well, do you think he understood your point? And he said he paused and he was listening. So I did my part, and it's only part one of the conversation. So I admire that they have each found a path of activism that works for each of them, and that they are very, very strong in their convictions. And so it leads to really interesting perspectives, and it's changed my perspective because, I think I came from a different path at one point, and I was having a different way of looking at something. And after sitting down and having a debate, we're a family that loves to debate. I kind of sat back and said, wow, they've got some really valid points that I can appreciate now because they are adults. And I think Rhonda said, one of you said, you're always their parent. That's ever so true. And when my daughters go into a march, don't get me wrong, I'm kind of like, okay, now make sure you've got on good shoes and you've got water and you keep an eye on your friends and you got your emergency stash money. But at the same time, I'm so proud of her that she goes out there and she's an educator and she's taking her position based on her role as an educator. And I love it. But it's very different than the way I was raised to think about activism and think about trying to have a cause that you really are passionate about. So I'm enjoying this phase, but I have to believe it started when they were younger and us talking about events that were happening. But nowhere did I ever take them to a march or, that wasn't the way I functioned, but they've moved in completely different directions without necessarily following my path.
Seeing the same thing in my kids. My daughter, she went to a school in Pittsburgh, a theater school, so she's an actress. And she had said that, during her time at the school, they only did one play that involved Black actors and actresses. And they only, in that one play, only had one Black writer. All the rest of the material that they taught them throughout that time that she was at school wasn't highlighting any of that. So her and a number of her alumni students have now, created this group, and now they're working with the school to ensure that, the professors are now incorporating that into their studies or what they're teaching, and ensuring that there's more diversity in the programs that they do. So that's, a good thing that she's transitioning and trying to give back. And then my son, again, still in college, he's with a fraternity that's mostly white. So all of his brothers, again, it's a mix, but majority white. But again, he is trying to elevate their awareness of racism. And so they have serious conversations, especially around right now, what's going on and that sort of thing. So it's good to hear, the things that we instilled with them when they were young, and now they're using it as they're adults.
It's interesting when I think back about kind of just the cycles that the country has gone through in terms of its kind of racial reckonings of 60s and now and through today, and kind of that continuum, that pathology is parenting, Donté, as you said. We kind of went from a time of real overt activity to sort of more covert, I would describe, more quiet, more polite. My parents taught me to be very polite in reaction to racism, right? It was a very controlled, kind of polite. I remember watching you and the other hosts on Text to Table talking about assimilation and code switching. And that was really kind of the era that I came up in. And now it makes me so happy to see that in spite of what is very gruesome and disheartening in terms of a return to real overt racism, and not so much an entire return, but more of a heightened awareness because of technology and video and media being what it is. We've got like this lovely kind of comfort with resistance, a kind of empowerment I'm seeing. And I know that I'm trying to cultivate in my children, and it's true for my 30-year-old who's an activist, and it's true even for my 8, almost 9-year-old. We find ways for each of them to interrupt racism in their day-to-day lives. And I like to think that some of the things that we are doing as parents, my husband and I, are helping to build that confidence, build that knowledge, build that ability to resist in ways that are appropriate for their age. So my youngest, as an example, gets to resist in ways like loving her hair, right, in its natural state. I never saw my hair's natural state until about 10 years ago. But she's got to not only love her own, but then that comes out of her to those people around her. And it's a love and a different identity around that beauty. It comes out in how she interacts with toys. And so many other ways that she's able to speak out and speak up. If there's a cartoon that comes out that's super popular and it's all white, she is empowered and knowledgeable enough to give real critique to that, to say, you know what, I really like this, but it really seems unrealistic that there's no brown people, Mom. Is it just me? Right? And that makes me just, so proud, because I know that that's really what's needed, that in some cases are being so polite and not really discussing, sometimes even with our own parents. But certainly I know many of my friends who are not Black never knew many of the experiences I had and that my family had with really overt racism. I didn't talk about it. And our kids often are growing up in a different time in a more empowered way to help themselves and society kind of navigate a different direction.
Dresden, I know children are biracial, correct?
Right.
Are you and your husband, who is white,
yes,
are raising your children to identify as Black children then?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We are raising our children to identify as Black children. I don't think there's any way you could do that in this country that we live in now. But I mean, I'd love to see a successful model open to that. But we always knew that that's what we wanted to do. It's rightly because for me, it's going back to this piece on protection. That's how the world's going to see you, and that's how they're going to treat you. And so I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. Now, if they get older and they, decide for themselves how they want to define themselves, they can certainly do that. But, if you ask my children, what are you? They're going to say I'm Black, but my daddy's white. And that's honestly how they respond. And going back to that protectionist piece, which I think is really, again, really critical to how I raise my kids, is this is also about protecting yourself and understanding, you know, when we go to these marches and these demonstrations, my kids are understanding the political process, right? There's a political process around oppression and racism and sexism and all of those pieces. And so when we go to these marches and these demonstrations, and yes, it's been all summer, and yes, it's been through COVID, and we mask up if you look at any of my pictures online, but I felt an intense responsibility to take them there, even through COVID. I felt an intense responsibility to do it. I also felt in my own world, I was feeling really depressed and I just needed to go out and just scream and be in the crowds and be with the people. And as my son, who's just so hyper aware of things, as he's become more aware of things, he needed it too. One of the things that happened is going back to this protectionist piece. And I tell this story often. When we moved into the house that I live in now, which is my dream house, it's our kind of forever home. And we picked it because on both sides, it's a cul-de-sac. And so it's a private interest and it's a cul-de-sac. And we are only the one other family of color. And one of the things that we did when we moved in about 19 months ago is we took my son. We did not take my girls. We took our son around to all of our neighbors on both sides of the cul-de-sac and introduced them to my son. And by the time we got to the second house, the woman burst into tears. It was a white woman. And she said, "I know why you're doing this." She's like, "I know why you're doing this. And it's a shame that you even have to." And I you know, it's hard not to get emotional when you talk about that story, but the conversation that we had to have with my son leading up to that, you know, my husband and I cried that night, you know, because it was a level of, you know, having to sort of steal that little innocence of him. But we wanted him to realize we're doing this to keep you safe. You know, after all these children who are outside playing with toys or doing normal things or going to a store are being killed and police are being, you know, called on them. You know, God forbid my parents don't see my neighbors don't see my 9-year-old son, you know, as someone who would try and hurt them or
correct.
You know, and so it was just very important that we did that, but it was also extremely difficult in a lot of ways to put my son through, but I knew I was doing the right thing.
I want to wind us down. We got a few minutes left in the episode. I think really quickly, I'm going to give each of you like 60 seconds to tell me what advice might you have for parents of color or, you know, those parents who are allies as well. What advice would you give them for raising their kids right now during this time?
So the advice I have for parents of color, whether you're a parent or not, and whether you are an ally or not, whether you are, you know, even if you are not of color, my advice is really one around fostering self-love. I think that there are tactics, some of which we touched on, that help with this. Traveling with your kids or traveling with the kids that you know being a big one. Being real careful about the toys that are in your home from an early age, and dolls in particular are a particular passion point for me. I could give y'all a whole dissertation on black dolls out here, and it started for me back when I was a young child, and my grandmother used to actually paint white dolls brown for me, because there weren't many black dolls to be had. And as a parent, I went on to make sure I found black dolls, had books with black characters, coloring books with black characters, and not just about blackness, just, you know, whatever, playing at the playground or what superheroes and all the different settings that any other kid wants to enjoy. Being able to see different identities and backgrounds represented was huge, and it's still harder than it should be. today. So fostering self-love through those kinds of small everyday tactics would be my big advice. And that goes for people of any race. One of my favorite kind of disrupt racism things I do, don't be surprised, friends, if Rhonda gives your child a black doll. Even if you're not black, because turns out my kids had white dolls their whole lives in addition to their black dolls. That's normal for black children to have dolls that are white. I want to normalize it being true the other way around as well.
I would say wanting to start with parents that are allies and who are not people of color, not raising children who are people of color. I would say really make sure that you have clear conversations with your children around seeing color. I know it can be very, people have the perception of like, we don't see color, we're all the same and all of that. And I understand that may be a philosophy or mantra of your family, but I want you to think about maybe unpacking that a little bit, because if you don't see my color, then you don't really know me. I mean, if anyone has really listened to this last hour intensely, they know that because of our Blackness, we have been through a lot, and we carry a lot with us, and we've passed that down to our kids. And so fundamentally, if you don't see my color, then you don't really know me. You're not really looking to get to know me and who I am completely. And how I present myself. So that's one thing. A second thing is, it kind of goes with the first, is fill in the blanks. So, if you are uncomfortable talking about race or prejudice or homophobia or whatever it's going to be, because it's all out there these days and your kids are hearing it no matter what. So what I'm saying to you from a very early age, your kids are getting the media, they're getting the stereotypes, they're getting the images, they're getting maybe self-hate, they're getting all kinds of things. And if you are not going to fill in that blank for them, they're going to fill it in themselves. And I guarantee you it won't be with your same values or belief systems. So address it now, early and often.
But my message is actually to the allies. I think there are a lot of people. I think a lot of us are probably many people's only Black friend, right? Just because I'm your friend doesn't mean you're an ally. Just because I've known you for 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, doesn't mean you're an ally. And allyship is demonstrative. It's visible. And so if you're going to be an ally, be visible so your children see it. And I can tell you, I've been so hurt because of people who in the past I would consider my sisters, very good friends. During these last years when all this stuff has happened, silence, nothing, especially this year when I just, knew. And I felt like I'm not coming to you. You need to call me and see if I'm okay. And I can tell you, I was deeply, deeply, deeply hurt by the silence and had to cut some people off. They still don't, I'm sure they figured out now why, but I just had to cut them off. But all that to say, I did see examples of other people who were in my life who took very active stances to share with me, but also with their children about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, how you can approach people. And we have some family friends who, when you're in these environments that are majority white, you kind of figure out how to navigate your way through. And it's not often that people step up and step out to build relationships, to talk to you, to bring you into the fold. And there's this one particular family that did that for us at the Quaker school. And I will never forget them, just the nicest people. And they demonstrated what's the word? Brotherly love, agape. Was it agape?
Agape.
Agape. They really demonstrated that. they had different people always enter their homes. They made a point of talking to people, and it was genuine. And you can tell, and people, you can tell when it's fake. We may just say, okay, and let you go on, but we know when it's fake. But your children see it. And what I loved about this family was that you could see their children acted in the same way, and it was beautiful. And so demonstrate it, be active, stand up for your friends, stand up for people of color. Like if you can't stand up for your friends, then, what are you saying you are? Because you're not, And so that's my thing. Be firm, be bold, because it means a lot. Because we see it, we feel it, we understand it, and it just really, really means a lot. So
cool. I would say, as a talking to the parents, and it doesn't matter if your child is young and older, teach them to be influencers. I mean, we talk about allies, teach them how to speak to other individuals and make them recognize the wrongs over the rights. Because I think, again, as I talked earlier, there's that unconscious bias, and a lot of people just don't realize that they're doing the wrong thing. So I think we can teach our kids to help identify these issues or things that these individuals are doing. So it's all about communicating that and then allowing them to be influencers. That's what I would leave with everybody.
So I would say that it's really important with everything that's going on in the world right now that the adults serve as parents, that we have conversations with our children that that are age appropriate, but no matter how old they are, let's talk about what's going on and let's talk about how they feel about it. And sometimes it's you want to be their friend. And I will just say that it's better to wait until they are adults to be friends. But while they're in that formidable, trying to understand and figure out the way of the world, use that time that you have, because it goes by very quickly, to be the parent and the guiding light that they need. And the other thing that I would say is, my daughter gave the message at church on this past Sunday, and the title of the message was, "It Takes a Village." And that's a saying that I have used through their entire lives, because as a working mother, I had to have other people that were helping in various ways, from my parents and in-laws, from good friends. And it's important that the people you put in your children's lives are allies, and they understand what's going on and what it means, and that they can support what you're trying to teach your children. So I think it's important that you understand you need to have a village around you, and you need to have, honest conversations, but age appropriate. And you have plenty of time to become their friend. I mean, I'm so proud to say that I'm friends with my children now. They will tell you that was not always the case, but we survived it and have gotten to this point. So, be the parent you need to be today.
Wow. So that's like 5 mic drops for y'all right there. Those were all really great points. So powerful. I want to honor and thank each of you for being on this show tonight, for being very transparent with us, not only about your childhood, but about your parenting, both what you're doing and the things you're nervous about. It really takes guts and courage to really speak out right now. And I want to show my appreciation for you all doing that and participating in this show tonight. For all of you watching, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I want to encourage you to share this conversation with your circles. I want you all to understand just how important parenting is and critical it is if we are going to make change for the future of our country and our world moving forward, and also eradicating racism. Parents have a major responsibility in that and what they're teaching their kids now. So thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you'll continue the conversation. Also, if you haven't joined our listserv yet, please do so. You can go to texttotable.com. You can find our podcast, our webcast, and also sign up for our email listserv, which gives you information in advance on when our news episodes are going to be dropping, and other important information about Text to Table. Last commercial. Our next Text to Table episode will be coming in November, where we're going to talk about leadership and communication in race. So we hope you'll join us. And until then, be well, be safe, and stay healthy. Thank you all so much. Cheers.
Cheers.